Recording. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, June 13th. And my name is Heather Kraus. I'm the founder of an organization called We All Count, and I'm a mathematical statistician. And so the purpose of We All Count is to build tools and provide support and training to anybody from any sector, any part of the world that is interested in aligning the choices that they're making in their data projects with their equity goals, with the values, priorities of their specific project in their specific context. And one of the things we do, to be really honest, my favorite thing that we do is we host these informal gatherings most Fridays, and they're called Talking Data Equity. So if this is your first time joining us, welcome. We're very happy you found your way to us. And if you're a regular, again, thank you, because without the regular community of participants, I would be lonely talking to the speakers alone. And the idea behind Talking Data Equity is that we wanted a space where anybody at any level of data or technical proficiency, working in any sector, doing this for decades, or just starting to think about this can kind of come to a place where they know they're going to learn something concrete, hear about a practical tool or a practical technique or an important idea that can help them kind of move the needle on their own equity in a real world way. And so sometimes we talk about specific techniques, and sometimes we do like in the weeds data work, and sometimes we have special guests. And today we have a special guest who I am extraordinarily excited about, and I'll introduce our guest in just a moment. Before I do, let me do a little bit of housekeeping. This session is recorded, and the reason it's recorded is because there's lots of people who want to learn and can't come at this specific time. And so we share the recording in our data equity community forum. I just put the link to that in the chat. So you can always go there and watch a recording if you've had to miss something. I'll also put links to lots of the references and resources that we're going to talk about today. As I put the recording up, I'll also put lots of links to those resources. And the last thing I'll say in terms of links is here's a link to the Talking Data Equity homepage. If you're ever wondering who's on Talking Data Equity today or what's the topic, you can always look there, and you'll see who's coming. And also we're in the process right now of booking our late summer and fall guests. So if you have a recommendation or you want to recommend yourself, that's the place to do that. So I'm going to turn it over to the special guest, and the special guest is going to share some stories, share some of their work. And while they do that, they're going to share some slides. And we're going to ask that while our guest is sharing those stories, that you keep your microphone turned off, because there are like 100 or so of you here. And feel free to use the chat. And then given assuming that there's time left at the end, we will have opportunities to turn your microphones on, ask questions, and have discussion and conversation. So that's kind of the housekeeping. So enough from me. Let me turn it over to a very special guest who I'm a big fan of her work, and delighted that she has made time in her very busy schedule to come and be with us. Today, we are very, very privileged to have Dr. Krystal Tsosie with us. Dr. Tsosie is from the Diné Navajo Nation, and PhD, MPH, and MA as an assistant professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. She's also the associate director of the Biodiversity Knowledge Integration Center at ASU, and the co-founder of the Native Biodata Consortium, the first Indigenous-led biological and data repository operating within the jurisdictional bounds of a U.S. tribal nation. Her genomics research interests are specific to Indigenous communities and people in precision health, conservation biology, and paleogenomics. She is also an expert in bioethics, data policy and governance, and developing digital data tools rooted in machine learning approaches to advance the sharing and informed consent of genomic data. Her work is internationally covered in the media. She is on ethical advisory boards for many national and international government and science policy organizations, including work with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the World Health Organization, the American Society of Human Genetics, and others. So you can see that we are very, very privileged to have the opportunity to learn from Dr. Tsosie today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Krystal. Thank you for coming.
Hi, yet Ebene. Good morning, all. That is how you say good morning in Diné, which is my language. I am coming to you today, this morning, from Autumn Lands in and around Phoenix, Arizona. But I myself am a guest. My peoples are actually from northern Arizona and also Utah and New Mexico, all the way up to actually what's now known as Wyoming. I wanted to speak to you today, first starting with a story, sort of exemplifying narratives told with genomic data, and then also sort of challenging its open data movement. I think we too often jump easily on the bandwagon that we just need all data and that data is implicitly going to be for good. And we forget that this is kind of a privileged notion and that we should also be cognizant that data could be used for not so good purposes. And I wanted to provide a couple of examples that sort of quickly show how entrenched and deeply embedded injustices related to data and also health equity can be intertwined, especially in the spaces of genetics and genomics in which I operate. So if you don't, for me, I am the first Indigenous geneticist at Arizona State University. That's a huge deal because Arizona State University is a large Research One institution. It's one of the largest public institutions in the world. It has also the largest number of Indigenous faculty and students, but I'm the only one Indigenous faculty member who's in the School of Life Sciences, which is like a quarter of the university. And I'm really happy to return because do a lot of things related to genomics in all spaces, human and related to our non-human kin, and also increasingly related to artificial intelligence and new approaches in like organoids and gene editing approaches, etc. And as fascinating as this all is, I'm also really happy to think about largely data policy, data governance questions, and because all of these questions, despite the data type, overlap in terms of like how should we be using data responsibly, ethically, if at all, and who does data truly benefit? And this is just a shout out to my team. I'm really happy that since I graduated 3 years ago and started my lab 2.5 years ago, that we've expanded to a 12-member team, expanding across multiple different global Indigenous nations to include Indigenous students at all levels. And I'm super happy because the the generation between training the next generation of Indigenous data leaders is incredibly short. And this is just a picture that was taken a couple weeks ago at the ASU Indigenous Convocation Ceremony. And I'm happily on the committee for the new Dr. Alicia de Mesa, new Master Ruben Chukbak, and also my two undergrads, Caroline P. and also Jonah Holiday. So I'm really happy to be able to use my platform to be able to train the next generation. But I first want to start off with a story. Thank you so much for giving me that introduction. I wanted to share with you a story that starts first with my peoples. And according to one of our many origin narratives, at one point, Diné, the Holy Ones, presented our people with a choice between two different powders. One, tratadine, which is corn pollen, which is integral to a lot of our ceremony and everyday use, medicinally, and also, of course, is an important food crop for our sustenance. But then also another yellow pollen, shitso, which is like yellow monster. And it is actually referring to uranium. And our people, according to the story, chose Tiltadine. And the gods nodded in assent that we had made the right choice. But this also came with a warning that we were to leave the other yellow powder in the ground. So now we sort of skip over toward the ramp up to World War II. We're talking about the beginnings of the atomic age. We're talking about mining uranium that ended up being utilized in some of the first nuclear weapons to be introduced in war in Japan. And we had to question where did that uranium come from? And it actually came from our lands and also mined from our people. And even then, at this time period, many of these are our peoples were born not U.S. citizens. Native Americans in the U.S. were not granted citizenship by the U.S. until fairly late in the 1900s, and many of these workers were didn't have birth certificates. There was a lot of industrial racism, and the proto-OSHA at the time, even though they had safety standards for miners, oftentimes the miners that they didn't turn on the fans for ventilations unless safety regulators were coming. So these miners were forced sometimes underground or in above open pit mines. They're just breathing in this uranium dust day in and day out. And also to add more discomfort to the story, there was already murmurings of evidence of smoking and tobacco use being linked to lung cancer. So the employers are actually handing out cigarettes to the Navajo miners, even though tobacco wasn't used in that way for our peoples. And so that decades later, when many of our men were dying from lung cancer, in lawsuits, they could say attribute it to the cigarette smoking and tobacco use, as opposed to the obvious link with uranium mining. So, to add to this story, we have to also understand that women and children were also are in and around the mines, and miners would come home, and it would be the wives and mothers and other women who would be responsible for cleaning their uniforms, and also feeding their children with dust that has been like interred onto their food. And what ended up happening is at the end of this mining period, many of the mines shut down. The tailings blew across the Navajo Nation and irradiated a number of our lands. And then also the dams that were meant to keep in the irradiated waters were very leaky and faulty. And you have a number of super funds actually around the Navajo Nation. And we have a huge aquifer system, but it's contained within sedimentary rock, which is very porous. So we have had a number of water-related disasters from these uranium tanks that have just, irradiated our actual drinking water. But also like sometimes women, like for the couple decades after this period, they were pulling water from these sources and using it to not only make meals and feed their children, but often to feed like mixed formula for their babies. So it was estimated that for each day a pregnant woman drank 3 liters of water from these uranium open-mined pits, she was exposed to uraniums at over 100 times the federal maximum. And there was at one point where the government actually handed out uranium badges to our people, and those results were never returned to us, especially related because they didn't want evidence to be used while these lawsuits for reparations were starting to emerge. So just to give us like an understanding of like how much this was impacting our life and how just it became a part of our bodies. This is a quote from an article that stated like we washed our hands in it, we drank in it, we ate in it, it was sweet. So this actually started at the same time the emergence of a rare life-threatening condition that was called in scientific literature and medical literature Navajo neurohepatopathy because it impacted largely the lives, the nervous system and liver of children. So the symptoms included like neuropathy, poor weight gain, short stature, some serious like immune deficiencies, liver problems, and it was just something that we were never really told about the danger of. But it was interesting because if you look at scientific and medical literature, even up until 2007, that used this term Navajo neurohepatopathy, it was meant as like a form of whitewashing this obvious link of uranium, that this was a disease that was caused supposedly by incest and consanguinity. Those terms were used. The term genocide was never used on our people. Instead, terms like population bottlenecks were used. And the term population bottleneck was never used in context to like our true actual history, which in the late 1800s we had a period called the Long Walk in which over 50% of our peoples were forcibly removed. And during this walk, our people starved and were just geographically displaced. So that large population reduction wasn't called genocide, it was called a population bottleneck. And later, this disease was actually almost blamed on us as a nature of our supposed incest, which is against our cultural traditions. So, a concern here, though, is that the literature actually support and the language supported this supposedly in genetic innate cause for this disease that impacted our population that had never been seen before. And yet the very obvious connection to environmental injustice was absolutely ignored conveniently. And this is a problem, especially as we think about rare variant research. Now, the term Navajo neurohepatopathy is now called MLD. Um, and we've just kind of ignored that we've shifted calling this the leukodystrophy and still it still persists that oh this very very condition is over represented in Navajo people, so it's a Navajo disease. And that's just wrong. Because now there's increased calls to study and gain access to our genomic information, our DNA, to study why this is a condition in our communities, whereas really the question is, can we clean up the super funds that are dotting our communities? And this question pops up over and over and over again. Many people look to nuclear power as like a green eco-friendly solution, but they conveniently forget that that uranium has to be mined from somewhere. And actually, not too long ago, there was a lot of increased interest in reopening mines on Navajo Nation. But then, right when the US government was going to forcibly exert economic power onto the Navajo Nation to reopen our mind, we had that nuclear power disaster that occurred in Fukushima. So then now again, economics and it's cyclical. Like every time the price of uranium is convenient for questioning nuclear power, it reemerges without context of this history. So going now, that was my story. Now you framing like this question of, well, we just need more genomic data from Indigenous peoples if we want to ameliorate health disparities. This is actually a trope statement that is stated time and time again from non-Indigenous researchers about our people, really tag teamed with like this felt notion that if we want to increase diversity, if we want to ameliorate health disparities, that we just need more Indigenous peoples in research. And it's almost like this get language, like we're being chased around with a giant butterfly net to try to be recruited into studies. And this language is still used despite the backdrop of like of the last 25 plus years in genomic studies of Indigenous people still constituting less than 1% of research participants. And I have to say that this is not a matter of increasing engagement, it's a matter of actually thinking about overcoming mistrust, prioritizing benefit sharing, and also empowering data decision-making equity. And I want to also just state that when we as Indigenous geneticists started the Native Biodata Consortium, we had a soft launch at a professional society meeting, and we had three pharmaceutical companies that were interested in meeting with us, and they wanted to know the same two questions: how many people who are Indigenous recruited in our studies, and across what conditions and phenotypes. So we pushed back. We basically presented them a list of conditions that primarily impact our peoples. So these are like childhood conditions, other types of metabolic disorders, etc. And we asked the drug companies, why can't you use our people's DNA or data to study diseases and conditions that primarily impact us? And they said, because we constitute fewer than 3% of the general population, it would not be profit generative for them. So it's not profit generative for pharmaceutical companies to extract our data and DNA from our peoples to study things that impact us. It has to benefit the larger population. And this is why I don't like the term democratizing research, because the term democratizing is used in the context of benefits most, and that system will always be used to disenfranchised, minoritized, or the minority. It is not a synonym for equity, and often it is used as a synonym for equity. So I encourage you to please really critically think about the term democracy and how it's used in terms of data, especially since I don't know what system of democracy is we're idealizing here, especially considering what's been going on in the US government. I'll call our US government out. That is not a system that I think that we should, or a model that we should be aiming towards modeling. So anyway, simply dropping genetic tests in our communities is not going to solve this health equity problem, nor simply just gathering data from our communities, because this doesn't respond to the simple fact that our Indigenous health services infrastructure, which by treaty is supposed to provide us healthcare, they're chronically underfunded to the fact that even before the pandemic, the amount of funding for Indigenous patients was several fold less than the dominant population. And it's certainly been widened after the pandemic. And yet, constantly tribal leaders and tribal members are constantly told over and over again, oh, you're going to miss out on the benefits of precision medicine, genomic medicine if you don't participate. And that is a form of victim blaming if we're not also changing the dynamics of power that have disenfranchised Indigenous peoples. So of the federal government's promise to provide healthcare to Indigenous peoples, which was done in exchange for access to our lands and our natural resources, the federal government only covers 60% of healthcare needs for American Indian individuals in the US. And I've heard from a Navajo Surgeon General who has serviced many of the indigenous nations in Arizona and New Mexico that she states that genomics medicine will never be a benefit to indigenous peoples. This is something that she said to a meeting at Cold Spring Harbor in October of last year. And that is because there's a huge backdrop of poor infrastructure. And also, you cannot sell us on the next advantage of genomic medicine when we don't even have access to water, like water to wash our hands, water to prevent viral transmissions during the next emergency public health state, etc. So just in terms of what this means, if you're unfamiliar with how an Indigenous patient seeks care, um, many times if an Indigenous patient is seeking care through an IHS system, they have to be referred out to specialty care if they want to even think about receiving a genetic test. Sometimes this specialty care clinic is over several hundred miles away, several hours drive one-way distance. It means time off of work, a working car, fuel, somebody to take care of the kids, etc. But also only a handful of genes that are used in clinical testing have information related to Indigenous peoples anyway. So it's not like the tests are incredibly useful for us. And also, there are concerns here that the US federal privacy law for genetic information doesn't adequately protect Indigenous peoples who seek care through the Indian Health Services. So this is what I describe like a catch-22, kind of like a, if you don't mind me cursing, damned if we do, damned if you don't type of situation. Because like for Indigenous peoples who maybe are presented with this question of whether or not to participate in clinical genetic testing, some may not be able to afford or even access to test. And some who do agree to participate also implicitly broadly consent to any secondary data usage and ownership by testing companies. So this means that just simply the fact of giving your blood to a clinical genetic test, which may not be that useful to you if you're Indigenous to begin with, your company owns the data. And this is a question that many people are grappling with the bankruptcy of 23andMe right now, is whether or not the corporate ownership of genomic information is an overextension of corporate rights. So in either scenario, Indigenous peoples are deriving little to no clinical utility. Now I'll ignore the stuff on the right side of the screen for time. So I want to describe here that like we have to be very careful. Too many times, politicians and lay members of the public, and even geneticists themselves, conflate Indigenous identity or indigeneity with a racial or biological construct. And I have to say that actually this is false. Indigeneity is a socio-political construct and less a biological category. And that's because our kinship structures were not always mediated by blood. We have other ways of incorporating individuals. We have other ways of, like, for instance, for Diné people, before the 1940 Wheeler-Howard Act, which established these blood quantum rules, we called our clans by the people that we acquired into our tribe. So there was a Quetzalcoatl clan, there was Ute clan, there was Mexican peoples clans, etc. That was under this unified cultural identity, but it was acknowledged that it was like a heterogeneous background. And it wasn't until like the US government wanted access to our lands and our resources, wanted to disenfranchise us, that they created these blood quantum rules that then screwed up everything, basically. And of the publicly available data from our genomic information, it comes from really largely non-US tribes that are largely politically disenfranchised, sometimes in countries that don't even acknowledge the right of their indigenous peoples to live and exist. They're also granting access to researchers to come into their country borders to gather DNA from indigenous peoples, which is wrong. And that's then used to create inferential statements for all US indigenous peoples. So if we're talking about like the latest report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that came out 2 years ago, that stated that researchers should not use race as a proxy for human genetic variation, and we should be moving away from eugenic notions. Here is an example in which researchers are continuing to perpetuate those notions if we're not careful. And then I just want to really quickly go through a couple of points. One, that when going back to this question, who does this benefit? In 2007, a reporter went back to one of the Central Amazonian peoples and basically asked, what was it that researchers promised you in exchange for your blood? And the tribal leaders said, we were promised therapeutics to cure the things that were afflicting our peoples. And the reporter had to say, I'm sorry to say that your genomic material, your cell lines are being sold by Coriell Cell Repository for $75 to $85 a vial. And in the same article, these two quotes exist. One from a tribal leader that said we were duped, lied to, and exploited. And then one from an NIH leader who stated the scientific community is using these samples, which are accepted and maintained under perfectly legitimate procedures for the benefit of mankind. So for the benefit of mankind, but not for the peoples that are providing the data that create the innovations to begin with. So this gets me to the point of like, what is genomic data sovereignty? Why is it important? So data sovereignty, and particularly indigenous data sovereignty, is the right for indigenous nations and peoples to exercise authority, agency, and autonomy for self-directing decisions about their genomic data. And this is important because tribal nations are starting to utilize this as within their own power to decide what happens to their data and their DNA. As one step for this, I and my friends and colleagues, we started the Native Biodata Consortium to provide an alternative to create a biological data repository that is governed under tribal law, that operates on tribal lands by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous scientists, and from research questions that come from Indigenous peoples themselves, not informed by an outsider who has no idea about our ways of living and how colonial dynamics have changed our ways of living. And when we do this, unsurprisingly, we're improving trust and we're increasing the quality of research questions because they're actually generated by us and for us. A part of what we were able to do is introduce high throughput sequencing to a rural tribal nation for the first time ever in partnership with Illumina. And we were able to create the first CLIA certified laboratory for delivering and testing for SARS-CoV-2 for COVID-19 testing. And so we were able to, just by having a laboratory in tribal lands in our pilot, be able to return tests that sometimes were 14 days later to like within 24 hours, which was amazing. We have also been able to expand our understanding of gene variants for Lakota people, and the knowledge related towards like impact for rheumatoid arthritis, which heavily impact people in the Dakotas. And we've been able to do a lot of research in terms of microbiome research as well. So when we actually start creating a data repository and data servers and are generating data locally, we're also able to do really cool things like just upending how data is governed technologically. And this is how, by creating data portals, we are also able to improve on consent models. So instead of broad and blanket consent, everything, we're actually able to allow participants to tailor their consent preferences for the types of studies that their data will be included. But then also we're able to do things like include blockchaining on our data framework. So this is like a way of cryptographically blocking transactions or requests onto data. And we're situating indigenous peoples as authority nodes. So they're the ones that create the rules to accept or reject data sharing requests and also block unconsented secondary data sharing before harms ex can exist. And the other thing that we're able to do is for even for data that we don't completely govern locally, and we're now trying to expand rules for data that's either held in different nodes, or for indigenous communities that have different consent and sharing preferences, still think about how we can utilize federated approaches. And this is important because we don't need full access to train algorithmic models to involve our data. We can still be inclusive of Indigenous people's data, but in a way, in a fashion that actually respects tribal nations' jurisdictions. Um, so what happens is when we're able to create now a repository and data tools that are Indigenous led, we are now also able to train the next generation of Indigenous leaders. We just finished a workshop called Indigidata last week, which is meant to hold these tribal nation engagements on tribal lands. We've been able to hold these workshops in a variety of different spaces around the US. And by having them on tribal lands, we reintroduce the dollars back into tribal nations up to like 65%, as opposed to having it redirected into universities indirects. And we've been able to do a lot of cool things that are for data questions that are meaningful for tribes. things related to the soil and the microbiome and indigenous regenerative agriculture, gene editing and food sovereignty, using metabarcoding and eDNA for fisheries like cultural preservation of a fish like salmon, thinking about how we can preserve and redirect like the theft of specimens that have been collected in museums and bad collections. And this is incredibly important, especially as there's a heightened interest in biodiversity genomics. And then this last week, we actually did a workshop on Indigenous health and artificial intelligence. And it was our largest workshop to date. We had 150 applicants, and we were able to have 42 participants. So, like Plumbing, for instance, in the Pacific Northwest are interested, their fisheries departments are interested in using environmental DNA to determine the extent of non-native fish species on culturally relevant fish like salmon. This is intrinsically linked to like fishing rights, reclamations, food sovereignty. 2 years ago, summers ago, we were starting to think about how do we do like an entire workflow where somebody can collect DNA from like a plant or an insect. They can do the prep in field, store DNA on little microbeads, and also sequence the data on a sequencer that is just like can either fit in your pocket or you just shove in a backpack. And we're thinking about doing this for like how do we actually bring these resources from out of the laboratory into tribal nations that are under-resourced, and how do we build tribal data repositories that work for Indigenous peoples? So we're talking about here Indigenous data sovereignty and also Indigenous digital sovereignty. So data sovereignty, thinking about not only research capacity training and policy and law and governance, but then really thinking about the infrastructure and the technology that emerges and is actually operating under Indigenous tribal nations jurisdictions. And that leads us to like cloud solutions and other types of digital data tools rooted in machine learning and other encryption and data approaches. Yeah, thank you so much. It was so nice to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Krystal. This was so fantastic. So uh the story was such a good place to start because it really grounded us in remembering how you said at the beginning, like, we don't want to assume that all data is going to be used for good. um, and then with that grounding also showed us some real concrete practical solutions that are already making a difference, and hopefully people here can find a way to support and build on and continue to make sure that it is as inspiring as everyone is saying. Okay, so it's time for some questions. And so if you're in the room and you want to ask a question, you can either raise your hand using the little Zoom icon, or you can just turn your microphone on. We're a small enough group today that I think that would work fine. So is there anybody there are a couple of questions in the chat, some in public where everybody can see, and then some direct messages to me with a request to talk about some funding, how any of this is funded. Now, I don't want to put you on the spot. If you don't want to talk about that, you could certainly say, that's out of scope for this call. But it is a very interesting question. So how do you feel about that question? Should we
No,
pick
that's a great question. Thank you so much.
Okay.
M- a lot of our funding actually comes from philanthropic support,
Mhm.
which is actually what we prefer because receiving federal funds means then that there's usually like this implicit or explicit requirement to deposit the data publicly. And and usually that meant for genomic data, a database that the NIH runs called the Database of Genotypes and Phenotypes, or dbGaP. What we decided was we're just going to create our own repository. It is not, it's technically available to the public, but under tribal jurisdiction. So, and we serve to facilitate those type of data requests in partnership with the tribal nations. So it is kind of like an alternative. So going back to like the philanthropic support, that's great because those are usually charitable gifts and donations that are not tied with a like a request or some sort of requisite um tit for tat type things, and that works mostly for us. We did actually receive the number differs according to like what year we're talking about, but like a $7 million total award to create a tribal data repository to house federal data.
Mhm.
And what we've decided to do is re envision what a data repository is. It's not the thing, the box that holds the data. It's actually the policies and protections about the data. Because that's actually really what is responsive to tribal needs and concerns.
Right.
And that's at the end of the day, what it is all about is trust and protections. And so sort of answered your question, I went in a different tangent, so I'll stop.
Oh, it's doesn't feel like a tangent. It feels like the really the heart of what you're teaching us today, which is about checking every single assumption that we have. Sometimes, especially this group of people, there's a couple of assumptions we're pretty good at checking now, but like the very, very, very deeply assumed fundamental ideas of like ownership and access and what it takes to do science, you're really redoing it, and that's amazing.
Thank you.
um Thank you. I noticed for time you skipped the slide on dynamic consent. And I was really looking forward to that slide. Can you tell us a little bit about dynamic consent? Because I think it's something that many of us here really, really struggle with because we know that we're not doing as good of a job with consent as we could be. And so I'm wondering, like with something as sensitive as genomic data, what you're thinking about.
Okay, can you see the slide on
Yeah, I
dynamic?
can see the
Okay, good.
slide.
All right, so I have a whole other talk about this. So some point in the early 2000s, researchers actually realized that broad and blanket consent could potentially cause a lot of unethical problems. One of this was like the most infamous example for indigenous genomics, which is the Havasupai tribe suing the Arizona Board of Regents.
Oh.
What happened was the Arizona Board of Regents governs the three state universities in the state of Arizona. And a tribal nation who exists at the base of the Grand Canyon, it's a small community, about 400 members, wanted to start a study related to type 2 diabetes, which didn't exist in their communities before, and then was just skyrocketing. And they reached out to an anthropologist, and the anthropologist stated, well, I'm not a geneticist, but here's my colleague, Dr. Teresa Markow, who is a Drosophila, a fruit fly researcher.
Mm.
And so she collected consent forms from the tribal nation members, some of whom didn't, English wasn't their first language, or
Right.
they didn't have beyond a high school education. But it would have like a line, like we consent for the use of future use of this data for any research that benefits humankind or mankind or science, right? So
Hmm.
very permissive. And the community members later learned, once the study ended, that their data was being used to study other things that
Hmm.
had some stigma attached, some including like the inclusion of their data for studies related to like schizophrenia, some population origin stories that stated that they came across the Bering Strait as opposed to what they actually culturally believed in, which is that they came from the base of the Grand Canyon. And it wasn't until like a community member was attending an open dissertation doctor, like a student's defense, that she learned that her people's data was being studied, used for other things than what the original trust partnership was about, which was saying type 2 diabetes. And it
Right.
just basically escalated into this huge lawsuit where originally I think they were asking for like $40 million or something in restitution, but it got talked down to like $700,000 in a banishment order, preventing employees from Arizona State University from attending. And it was like it was already coming at a time where global indigenous peoples were appealing to the United Nations, basically concerned about gene patenting rules, and they were concerned that their peoples were being described as vanishing, and that there was this gold
Mm,
rush to mine our data, DNA, before we like disappeared off the face of the earth. So like the concern of the researchers was not like, well, why are indigenous peoples being terminated and assimilated? Like, no, the concern was, oh, we have this disappearing, vanishing population. Um,
right.
so,
Yeah.
so- yeah, anyway, so broad and blanket consent. For a while, it was like this pendulum swing, study-specific informed consent, but then it was too logistically burdensome to contact and reconsent participants over and over again. And then when this big data era movement of like the 2010s came up, where it's like, well, we need to harmonize and get data across everything. It moved back to broad consent, but it's like we didn't fix any of the problems beforehand. It turns out that when you have the ability to create just like an electronic management portal, data portal, you also open up the possibility for providing participants the option to change their consent preferences for the types of studies that they want to participate, and also change their consent preferences for future studies, and hopefully reduces that burden of recontact and repermission. And you also provide an opportunity for researchers to transparently describe at like a lay summary, like what actually was the result of those studies that utilize their data. So we're hoping that this like promotes transparency, increases public trust, and also, especially for rural communities, where and like many of us, we change our phone numbers, we move, that this will at least help in terms of some of those logistical challenges of recontacting participants.
Thank you so much for going back and walking us through that. I mean, that will be game changing for a lot of like equity concerned research. And I'm so happy to see that. Um, yeah.
I
Wait,
would love to,
I can keep asking questions. If anybody in the room wants to ask a question, this is your chance.
I mean, I would love to see consent change.
Yeah,
I've delivered a talk to largely institutional review board members, and I stated, hey, the rules that undergird how um, human subjects research is done in the US is outdated. Like
right,
the Belmont report, CFRs, like 45 CFR 46, if you know what that means, is outdated.
mhm,
These were rules that were written in response to other travesties that occurred. Like for instance, with human testing on Nazi incarcerated, not like victims of like the Nazi era, Tuskegee, etc.
right,
But also it was always written not with like understanding that the technology's changed. Allows like these were also written in terms of like just like supposed like Western
right.
individual autonomy and agency rules, which is not as meaningful for other cultures. So the entire rule book needs to be rewritten, and it's severely outdated. And yet we keep like harking back to these outdated ethical models and building policy on it. And we really do need to question like how we can make changes in all of these different spaces all at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is so accurate that the consent process that we think is quote like normal or quote best practices is absolutely embedding a very specific set of values, which is immediately problematic. I'm interested to hear about the community that sued. That seems like that's one effective mechanism of accountability. within like the scientific community, like the genomics or the academic research, are you aware of any other successful mechanisms of accountability, or do we just have to hope that people would, like if we were going to push on a lever of change, do you have any ideas about what lever we would push on, or is that like not what you're thinking about because you're building like the solution that is your lab?
No, I mean, this is a great question. We really talk about researcher ethics, but we don't have mechanisms for researcher accountability. We
Right,
really do
exactly.
not.
Yeah.
The only example, the clear cut, most clear cut example of researcher accountability that we have is plagiarism. But then
Mm,
like the onus of proof and the onus of harm falls on the victims of plagiarism. And
right.
then we kind of like lean on the institution of, okay, now it's up to you to make the deliberation. When it comes to like researchers doing unethical things, first we have to state, okay, there's a difference between what's ethical and what's legal. Just because it's technically legal doesn't mean it's ethical.
Mhm.
And also, just because it's ethical within your understanding of like individual autonomy and agency doesn't mean it's ethical within like the community members that we're supposed to be servicing, right?
Mhm.
And that's a fight. And I love the comment about consent forms turning into legal documents because that's true. It's kind of like I always tell this to my undergraduate students. Think about the latest social media platform that's in vogue, and in order to access it, you have to like go scroll through the end user license agreement. Who's reading it? Like, who's legitimately reading it line by line? Especially if it's 16 pages of material. Oftentimes, you're just scrolling through it because it's a lot of legal jargon, and you're just pushing accept. But do you actually know what you're agreeing to? And like that's one type of risk for our like selling our data to ad companies.
Right.
And like I like personally my shopping preferences I consider lower risk than my genomic information has the ability to not only re-identify me but everyone I'm biologically related to across
Right.
time. Like
Yeah.
we should not be consenting in the same way.
Yeah.
And like so public knowledge needs to increase, policy needs to change. The over permissiveness of commercial ownership over individual rights needs to be questioned by all people. And the technology is just becoming more and more invasive.
Mm.
And the levels of surveillance are becoming more advanced. And we really need to be more critical users of the data that we're in and critical producers of the data that we're producing as well. So, oh yeah,
Yeah.
this is a fun dark thing to think of before the weekend, by the way. So if everyone, I hope you have fun with your adult beverage of choice and like because this can spin off into a lot of different conversations, and this is where I am situated with data. So very quickly gets involved with data justice. I that's why my lab is the Tsosie Lab for Indigenous Genomic Data Equity and Justice, because you can't have equity without the justice, and we really shouldn't be thinking about producing any type of data without thinking about the underlying ethics.
I think that that is perfect, and we will leave it there. And I find your work to like certainly touch on dark topics, but bringing them into the light and showing us solutions or improvements. And I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing. And I know I speak for everybody here when I say thank you for spending the time to walk us through it. I am already getting tons of messages about how to send money, how to buy stuff. So I'll follow up with you offline. But I will echo your last sentence there and say, everybody who came today, make sure you take really good care of yourselves. I know this was a very impactful and affecting conversation. So make really sure that you take good care of yourselves and you take good care of each other. Mutual aid really works. And again, thanks for attending. We do have another Talking Data Equity next week, so come back if you're interested. And Dr. Tsosie, thank you so much for the work that you're doing and taking a little break from the work that you're doing to help us understand it.
Thank you. Yeah,
Bye.